Hello, and welcome back, my lovely Lovecraftians, to a new take on horror. This story is The Imp of the Preserve by Edgar Allan Poe, published in 1850. In the consideration of the faculties and impulses of the prima mobile of the human soul, the phrenologists have failed to make room for a prosperity which, although obvious, existing as a radical, primitive, irreducible sentiment, has been equally overlooked by all the moralists who have preceded them. In the pure arrogance of the reason, we have all overlooked it. We have suffered its existence to escape our senses solely through want of belief, of faith. Whether it be faith in revelation or faith in Kabbalah, the idea it has never occurred to us simply because of its supererogation. We saw no need of the impulse for the prostinity. We could not perceive its necessity. We could not understand, that is to say, we could not have understood, had the notation of this primum mobile ever obtruded itself. We could not have understood in what manner it might be made to further the objects of humanity, either temporal or eternal. It cannot be denied that the phrenology and, in great measure, all metaphysicianism has been concocted a priori. The intellect of logical man, rather than the understanding of an observant man, set himself to imagine design, to dictate purpose to God, having thus fathomed to his satisfaction the intentions of Jehovah. Out of these intentions he built his innumerable systems of mind. In the matter of phrenology, for example, we first determined naturally enough that it was the design of the deity that man should eat. We then assigned to man an organ of aliments, and this organ is a scourge which the deity compels man, will I, nil I, into eating. Secondly, having settled it to be God, will that man should continue his species, we discovered an organ of amativeness forthwith, and so with combativeness, with identity, with casualty, with constructiveness, so in short, with every organ, whether representing a prosperity, a moral sentiment, or a faculty of the pure intellect, and in these arguments and arrangements of the principle of human action, the Spurs Semites, whether right or wrong, in part or upon the whole, have but followed in principle the footsteps of their predecessors, deducing and establishing everything from the preconceived destiny of man and upon the ground of the objects of his Creator. It would have been wiser, it would have been safer, to classify, if classify we must, upon the bias of what man usually or occasionally did, and was always occasionally doing, rather than upon the bias of which we took for granted the deity intended him to do. If we cannot comprehend God in his visible works, how then in his inconceivable thought they call the works into being? If we cannot understand him in his object creatures, how then in his substantive moods and phases of creation? Induction a posteriori would have brought phrenology to admit, as an innate and primitive principle of human actions, a paradoxal something which we may call perseverance, for want of a more characteristic term in the sense I intended. It is, in fact, immobile without motive, a motive not motivert, though in prompting we act without comprehensible object, or if this shall be understood as a contradiction in terms, we may so far modify the proposition as to say that though it's prompting we act for reason that we should not in theory, no reason can be more unreasonable, but in fact there is none more strong. With certain minds, under certain conditions, it becomes absolutely irresistible. I am not more certain that I breathe that the assurance of the wrong or error of any action is often the one unconquerable force which impels us, and alone impels us its prosecution. Nor will this overwhelming tendency do wrong for wrong's sake, admit of analysis or resolution into ulterior elements. It is radical, a primitive impulse, elementary. It will be said, I am aware, that when we persist in acts because we feel we should not persist in them, our conduct is but a modification of that which ordinarily springs from the combativeness of phrenology, but at a glance will show the fallacy of this idea. The phrenology combativeness has for its essence the necessity of self-defense. It is our safeguard against injury, its principle regarding our well-being, and thus the desire to be well is excited simultaneously with its development. It follows that the desire to be well must be excited simultaneously, a modification of combativeness, but in the case of that something which I term perseverance, the desire to be well is not only aroused, but a strongly antagonistic sentiment exists. However, an appeal to one's own heart is, after all, the best reply to the sophistry just noticed. No one who trustingly consults and thoroughly questions his own soul will be disposed to deny the entire radicalness of the prosperity in question. It is not more incomprehensible than distinctive. There lives no man who at some period has not been tormented, for example, by an earnest desire to tantalize a listener by circumlocution. The speaker is aware that he displeases. He has every intention to please. He is usually curt, precise, and clear. The most laconic and luminous language is struggling for utterance upon his tongue. It is only with difficulty that he restrains himself from giving inflow. He dreads and deprecates the anger of him who he has addressed. Yet the thought strikes him that by certain involutions and parentheses this anger may be engendered. That single thought is enough. The impulse increases to a wish, the wish to a desire, the desire to an uncontrollable longing, and the longing to the deep regret and mortification of the speaker, in defiance of all consequences, is indulged. We have a task before us, which must be speedily performed. We know that it'll be ruinous to make delay. The most important crisis is our life calls, trumpet-tongued, for immediate energy and action. We glow, we are consumed with eagerness to commence the work with the anticipation of whose glorious result our whole souls are on fire. It shall be undertaken today, and yet we are put off until tomorrow. And why? There is no answer except that we feel preserved. Using the words with no comprehensiveness of principle, tomorrow arrives, and when in its impatient anxiety to do our duty. But with this varying case of anxiety arrives also a nameless, a positively fearful, because unfathomed craving for delay. This craving gathers strength at the moment. Fly. The last hour for action is at hand. We tremble with the violence of the conflict within us, of the definite with the indefinite, of the substance with the shadow, but in the contest have proceeded thus far. It is the shadow which prevails. We struggle in vain. The clock strikes, and in a knell of our welfare at the same time. It is the Chancellor. Note, the ghost that had so long overawed us. It flies. It disappears. We are free. The old energy returns. We will labor now. Alas, it is too late. We stand upon the brink, should I say, of a principle. We peer into the abyss. We grow sick and dizzy. Our first impulse is to shrink from the danger. Unaccountably, we remain. By slow degrees, our sickness and dizziness and horror become merged in a cloud of unnameable feeling. By gradations, still more imperceptible, this cloud assumes shape, as did the vapor from the bottle out of which arose the genius in the Arabian Nights. But out of this, our cloud, upon the perceivable's edge, there grows into palpability a shape far more terrible than any genius or any demon of a tale, and yet it is but a thought, although a fearful one, and one which chills the very marrow of our bones with the fierceness of the delight of its horror. It is merely the idea of what would be our sensations during the sweeping precipitation of a fall from such a height, and this fall, this rushing annihilation, for the very same reason that it involves that one more ghastly and loathsome of all most ghastly and loathsome images of death and suffering which have ever presented themselves to our imagination. For this very cause do we not now the most vividly desire it, and because our reason violently deters us from the brink, therefore do we the most impetuously approach it. There is no passion in nature so demonically impatient as that of him who, shuddering upon the edge of a precipice, thus meditate a plunge. To indulge for a moment in any attempt at thought is to be inevitably lost, for reflection but urges us to forbear, and therefore it is, I say, that we cannot, if there be no friendly arm to check us, or if we fail in a sudden effort to prostrate ourselves backwards from the abyss, we plunge and are destroyed. Examine these similar actions as we will, we shall find them resulting solely from the spirit of the preserve. We perpetrate them because we feel that we should not. Beyond or behind this there is no intelligible principle, and we might indeed deem this perseverance a direct instigation of the arch-fiend, were it not occasionally known to operate in furtherance of good. I have said thus much, that in some measure I may answer your questions, that I may explain to you why I am here, that I may assign to you something that shall have at least the faint aspect of a cause for my wearing these fetters, and for my tentating the cell of the condemned. Had I not been thus prolix, you might have either misunderstood me altogether, or with the rabble have fancied me mad. As it is, you will easily perceive that I am one of the many uncounted victims of the imp of the preserve. It is impossible that any deed could have been wrought with a more thorough deliberation. For weeks, for months, I pondered upon the means of the murder. I rejected 1,000 schemes because their accomplishments involved a chance of detection. At length, in reading some French memoirs, I found an account of a nearly fatal illness that occurred to Madame Palou. Though the agency of a candle accidentally poisoned, the idea struck my fancy at once. I knew my victim's habit of reading in bed. I knew, too, that his apartment was narrow, ill-ventilated. But I need not vex you with imperative details. I need not describe the easy artifices by which I substituted, in his bedroom candlestand, a wax light of my own making for the one which I had there found. The next morning he was discovered dead in his bed, and the coroner's verdict was death by visitation of God. Having inherited his estate, all went well for the years. The idea of detection never once entered my brain. Of the remains of the fatal taper, I had myself carefully disposed. I had left no shadow of a clue by which it would be possible to convict, or even suspect me of the crime. It is inconceivable how rich a sentiment of satisfaction arose in my bosom as I reflected upon my absolute security. For a long period of time, I was accustomed to revel in the sentiment. It afforded me some real delight than all the mere worldly advantages occurring from my sin. But there arrived at length an approach from which the pleasurable feeling grew by scarcely perceptible gradations into a haunting and harassing thought. It harassed me because it haunted. I could scarcely get rid of it for an instant. It is quite a common thing to be thus annoyed with the ringing in our ears, or rather in our memories, of the burthen of some ordinary song, or some unimpressive snatches from an opera. Now, will we be the less tormented if the song itself be good, or the opera air mysterious in the manner at last? I would perpetually catch myself pondering upon my security, and repeating in a low undertone the phrase, "I am safe. I am." One day, whilst sauntering along the streets, I arrested myself in the act of murmuring half aloud these customary syllables, and that of petulance. I remodeled them thus: I am safe. I am safe, yes, if I not be fool enough to make open confession. No sooner had I spoken these words than I felt an icy chill creep into my heart. I had had some experience in these fits of perversity, whose nature I had been at some trouble to explain, and I remembered well that in no instance I had successfully resisted their attacks. And now, my own casual self-suggestion that I might possibly be fool enough to confess to the murder of which I had been guilty confronted me, as if the very ghost of him who I had murdered, and beckoned me on to death. At first, I made an effort to shake off this nightmare in my soul. I walked vigorously, faster, still faster. At length, I ran. I felt a maddening desire to shriek aloud. Every succeeding wave of thought overwhelmed me with new terror, for alas, I too well understood that to think in my situation was to be lost. I still quickened my pace. I bounded like a madman through the crowded thoroughfare. At length, the populace took the alarm and pursued me. I felt them consummating my fate. Could I have not torn out my tongue, I would have done it. But a rather rough voice resounded in my ears yet again. A rougher grasp seized me by the shoulder. I turned. I'm gasping for breath. For a moment, I experienced all the pangs of suffocation. I became blind and deaf and giddy, and then some invisible fiend, I thought, struck me with his broad palm upon the back. The long imprisoned secret burst from my soul. They say that I spoke with a distinct enunciation, but with marked emphasis and passionate hurry, as if in dread of interruption before concluding the brief but pregnant sentence that consigned me to the hangman and to hell. Having related all that was necessary for the fullest judicial conviction, I fell prostrate in a swoon. But why shall I say more? Today I wear these chains and am here. Tomorrow I shall be fetterless. But where? Such concludes The Imp of Preserve by Edgar Allan Poe. I was absolutely self-shocked by the the similarities in story building to some of the other authors we read on this page. We got a real insight in how they perceive God, how they perceive civic duty, how they perceive that we constantly are waiting for tomorrow to come, but tomorrow is today, in a sense. Tomorrow is yesterday, is today is today. We have to act on our thoughts in the moment, but still, with perseverance, with God, with our own organs, we are always trying to make sure that we get what's in best interest. I love this because I think that people should always look out for themselves, but this took it a step further by not only looking out for himself, but looking out for his greed, his deadly sins. I've seen a few sins committed. The sin of pride. He took pride in being able to kill this person. The sin of greed. He greedily wanted that estate. The sin of lust. He was lusting after this false fantasy that he could just get away with it. He also had sloth because he wasn't acting on it. He was thinking on it for a while. And then he also had pride. He thought that he was safe. He thought that he wouldn't admit it. He thought it was just better than that. Like it wouldn't eat away that he just killed a family member. There's so much to unpack here altogether. Overall, the story just wrapped together so nicely. And I like the climax of the story where he's just terrified. It reminds me of some of his other stories, such as The Heart Beating Underneath the Floorboard or When the Raven Calls. It also is way longer than the short poems that we've read that also capture death, as most of his poems and stories do. The Imp of Preserve is the devil of our own preservations in a way. We are our own deadliest sin. If we don't do our manifest destiny as people to act upon the dreams that we want, but not the nightmares that we will commit. In my opinion, this read was something I wasn't expecting. At the beginning, I just thought it was going to be the ramblings of his religion and the ramblings of a madman. Even the own line was what I was thinking. I was thinking this wasn't even a horror story. But as I tied it all together, I realized it's one of the most fearful things we can do is to betray each other, betray one's trust. It was completely indigenous to the sense that this is something that commonly happened in the 1850s. It felt like I was reading an actual manuscript or a diary entry from a man that was on death row, repeating the thoughts in his head of everything he did. And even when he was talking about religion, reflecting on it, I know he was asking God for forgiveness. For he knew when he was peering into the abyss, he was peering into the depths of hell itself. For no sin is greater than the commitment of sin, of murder, of treachery, of betraying one's own flesh and blood. Some say that blood is thicker than water, but some say that oil floats to the top. You could see that oil was also a metaphor I'm using because it was used in more richer families. Though he is chasing that ideology of comfort, of perseverance, of riches, in the end his own soul was damned to the very depths of hell and will never know perseverance. It will only know pain. It will only know the gasping moments of what could have been if he only took the better path. But my lovely Lovecraftians, I would love to see what your thoughts are, so feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I hope that you enjoyed The Imp of Perseverance. We will be reading more stories from Robert E. Howard, Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, and of course, H.P. Lovecraft, my loves. Until next time, bye-bye.